Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we're doing something pretty cool. We're going to take Adam Smith's 250-year-old economic theory, the legendary invisible hand, and we're not just going to treat it like some sacred, untouchable gospel. Nope. We're treating it as a scientific hypothesis. We're going to toss it right into a modern analytical lab and stress test the heck out of it using cold, hard math.
Let's rewind a bit to that grand optimism of 1776. Adam Smith proposed this genuinely revolutionary idea that individual, competitive, and honestly self-interested behavior can miraculously weave together to create socially beneficial stuff. Think about a woolen coat. You've got the shepherd, the spinner, the weaver, the merchant, right? None of them are waking up saying, I want to clothe society today. They're just trying to make a living. But somehow all those purely selfish actions combine to produce something super useful for everyone else.
You've probably heard his foundational claim. Seriously, it's one of the most famous sentences in all of economics. We do not expect our dinner from the benevolence of the butcher, but from their regard to their own interest. It's a bold idea, right? It suggests we can literally just carve economics completely out of social or moral life and rely entirely on self-interest for a guaranteed good outcome. But, well, is that actually true? Does sheer greed really always work out for the best? To figure that out, here's our laboratory protocol for this explainer. We're going to cover 1. Adam Smith's foundational hypothesis. 2. The game theory laboratory. 3. Defining a good outcome. 4. Stress test, generic dilemma. 5. Stress test, the commons. And finally 6. A new map of society. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. Adam Smith's foundational hypothesis. We'll start our investigation right at the source, grabbing a modern analytical lens to look for any cracks in Smith's foundational idea. And right away, economist Amartya Sen gives us a brilliant modern critique to keep in mind. Yes, Smith absolutely nailed what motivates trade, but, and this is a huge but, just because self-interest motivates the butcher doesn't automatically mean that self-seeking behavior creates overall economic success. In fact, economist Duncan Foley calls this Adam's fallacy. It's this really dangerous assumption that all our deep moral and structural problems will magically just vanish into thin air the second you drop them inside a free market. Section 2. The Game Theory Laboratory. To properly investigate this fallacy, to see if the magic actually happens, we kind of have to leave 18th century philosophy in the rearview mirror and step into the precise mathematics of the 20th century.
Welcome to the Game Theory Laboratory. Economists use this mathematical framework to model strategic interactions between people. And to run a formal simulation here, you can't be vague. You absolutely need 5 rigid specifications. You need to know who are the players, what are their strategy sets, what are the specific numerical payoffs, what is the order of play, and finally, the information structure, basically who knows what and exactly when do they know it. So when we put those 5 specifications into motion, we can calculate exactly how players will react step by step to build a rational outcome. First, players look for their best response to maximize their own payoff. Now, if a strategy is always the best response, no matter what the other guy does, we call that a dominant strategy. And when everyone is playing their best response to everyone else's best response, boom, we hit step 3, the Nash equilibrium. That's the stationary point. It's the spot where nobody has any incentive to change what they're doing.
Section 3. Defining a good outcome. Now, before we actually run our first simulation, our lab needs a measuring stick. If Smith claims the free market outcome is good, we need to mathematically define what a good or beneficent outcome actually looks like.
So how do economists measure goodness? Well, they use something called Pareto efficiency. Under this concept, an outcome is only deemed genuinely efficient if we can make at least one person better off without hurting someone else. That's it. It's a measure strictly based on not making things worse for anyone involved.
But, as a benchmark, it has some pretty profound limitations that you should definitely take away from this. It's kind of crazy, but it's simultaneously too strong and too weak. It's too strong because it's inherently biased toward the status quo. Almost any real-world structural change is going to make someone, somewhere, temporarily worse off, right? And yet it's too weak because it entirely ignores fairness and distributive justice. It literally only cares about raw mathematical gain, not who actually gets what.
Section 4. Stress test, generic dilemma. All right, tools are assembled, our benchmark is set. It is time to fire up the lab and run our first real stress test against the invisible hand.
Enter the classic prisoner's dilemma. 2 players face a choice, cooperate or defect. In this scenario, the math creates an intense gravitational pull, and honestly, the result is a bit tragic.
Both players would clearly be way better off choosing to cooperate, reaching a Pareto-optimal state where they only lose a little. But nope. Pure, rational self-interest inevitably drags them both down to a terrible, highly suboptimal outcome where they both lose big.
And here is the absolutely crucial point, the rule of Nash. Once our players hit that mathematically inevitable equilibrium, it becomes completely self-enforcing. Neither individual has any incentive whatsoever to change their strategy on their own. This definitively proves that Adam Smith's vision of a magically optimal, beneficial outcome just isn't a guaranteed law of nature.
Section 5. Stress Test, the Commons. If that generic dilemma shows us how individual trust completely breaks down, our second stress test scales the whole problem up. Let's see what happens to an entire community.
Think about Garrett Hardin's famous 1968 model about shared resources. Imagine a group of farmers grazing their goats on a common village pasture. If a farmer adds an extra goat, they get 100% of the individual gain from that animal. But the environmental cost, the overgrazing and degradation of the pasture, well, that's divided among everyone. So what happens? The math directly incentivizes every single farmer to just keep adding more and more goats.
The math explicitly proves a massive divergence here. Even though there's a clear social optimum, the exact right number of goats for the pasture to survive, rational self-interest pulls everyone toward a completely different outcome. The Nash equilibrium dictates that far too many goats end up being grazed, which inevitably leads to the total destruction of the pasture.
Which forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question. Why does this systemic failure happen when every single farmer is acting completely rationally, perfectly following Adam Smith's rules of self-interest? Are we actually better off when everyone just looks out for number one? Or does this kind of unchecked rational greed inherently destroy the very shared resources we all rely on?
Well, the lab results are in. As Garrett Hardin so powerfully noted, this mathematically inevitable tragedy stands as a direct rebuttal to the invisible hand. Unchecked self-interest doesn't magically build us a nice woolen coat in this scenario, it literally eats the pasture down to the dirt.
Section 6. A new map of society. Now, we aren't going to just toss Adam Smith entirely out the window. The butcher and the baker still matter. But we urgently need a better, far more accurate way to map out how human interaction actually functions in the real world. If we look at the structural anatomy of human interaction, economic scenarios are generally bookended by two wild extremes. On one side, you have pure common interest where everybody's goals align perfectly, like teammates just trying to keep a company afloat. On the exact opposite side, you have pure conflict, a total zero-sum game. Every dollar player 1 gains is an exact mathematical loss for player 2. Think of it like fiercely dividing up a $100 bill.
But let's be real. Almost nothing in our actual lives is that cleanly separated. Our markets, our trade deals, our massive climate crisis, they all live in this incredibly messy middle ground between those two extremes. They contain these super complex elements of both overlapping common interest and really intense conflict.
And that brings us to a brilliant illustration of modern economic theory. This gives us a complete typology of social interaction. We can map common interest versus conflict against whether agreements are cooperative, meaning legally binding, or non-cooperative. It turns out Adam Smith's invisible hand isn't some universal law of gravity. It's actually just one highly specific cooperative mechanism that only operates under very particular conditions within this massive matrix of human behavior.
So I'm going to leave you with this to consider as you look at the world around you today. If self-interest only works under these highly specific conditions, and the invisible hand isn't going to just magically save us, how do we actively design a society that can survive our own rational greed? What kind of new rules and binding agreements do we absolutely need to build right now to protect our modern shared commons? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.